Hey everyone, this is the last lesson of the New Deal, last lesson of the week. Hope you are excited. I know the last one was a little lengthy, but I appreciate the feedback. It seems like even though it was a little bit longer, you guys still got a lot out of it. Good understanding of the programs and things like that. Today's lesson is relatively short. I just want to wrap up and kind of talk about the future of the New Deal and what kind of ends up happening. And then I want to spend some time talking about major arguments that have been made for why the New Deal was a failure and then why the New Deal was a success. And then I'm going to kind of put the responsibility on you. There's going to be some primary sources posted on Google Classroom, and I'm going to have you create a little bit of a written response based on what we've talked about this week, based on what the primary sources are saying, and kind of taking some time to really think about how we should remember the New Deal. Was this a total failure? Was this a total success? Or was it more somewhere in the middle? And why should we think of it that way? Anyways, that's what we'll kind of do. Again, like I said, the lecture itself, not very long, but there's some interesting developments that occur that I want to walk you through. So I mentioned this really briefly at the end of last class, which is that in 1936, FDR has a major victory for president. And again, the popular vote heavily in FDR's favor, the electoral college vote, that is just unsightly, basically. And what we want to kind of think about is why FDR wins so big in 1936. Well, something that FDR, and he was doing this in 1932 as well, is he always talked about the forgotten man. And this was like your average poor American that early reform under Hoover had not helped. And so he's going to use that expression a lot. He returns to using that expression in 1936. Says, hey, this is about helping out the average American. All right. This is about getting money into people's pockets, individuals' pockets. This is helping individuals be able to pay their rents or pay their mortgages and things like that. So, because of that, the common voter is going to feel a real connection to FDR and want to vote for him again in 1936. You also remember that FDR is the one using the government's money in order to pay people, in order to provide jobs and all that kind of stuff. Very rare that somebody's giving out money and they're not going to have high approval. Some will even say when FDR is elected in 1936 so easily, well, of course, he's like Santa Claus. Everyone is going to elect Santa Claus. So that kind of idea that because he was giving out the money, of course, he's going to be reelected. Obviously, he has support from workers in 1936, had tried to help them out. Workers did feel like he was so pro-union, and in many senses he was, so that's going to be a good deal. He also got a good support from the Catholic and Jewish population, which by the 1930s had become pretty sizable, as kind of what you're starting to see is descendants of Irish Catholics, now numerous, having lived in the United States for a few generations. Same thing with Jews having lived in the United States for a generation or two. So we're starting to see those numbers grow. We're starting to see Catholics and Jews become more influential and, to be honest, mistreated in the United States for most of the time up to this point. And this is really the first time where they feel like they have a political leader that takes care of them. So that's going to help explain FDR's support as well. More than anything else, what the election of 1936 signals is that people like the New Deal, people like what it's providing, and FDR certainly feels that way, and he feels like this is a mandate basically from the American people. He's not only going to look at 1936, he's also going to look at his resounding victory in 1932 and the Democrats' victory in the Congress in 1932. He's going to look at the Congress's victory in 1934, also Congress's victory in 1936, as well as his own, and say this is a mandate from the people. Okay, they like the New Deal. So we need to make sure we're doing everything to continue the New Deal. So after he's elected, it looks very much like the New Deal is going to continue, that momentum still going in that upward direction. And actually, I just want to make this comment quickly. After FDR was put into office in 1933, one of the first pieces of legislation that'll be passed that's outside of the New Deal is going to be the 20th Amendment. And this changes the inauguration of the period from March, which it originally was, into January. And that minimizes that lame duck session from 4 months to a little over two. And you remember that after FDR was elected in 1932, about that 4 month lame duck period where Hoover's kind of not well, really the depression getting worse as Hoover's still the president, but people don't really obviously want him. And so this is the time where that's changed. FDR now able to start his second term sooner than before, feels this momentum on his side. Let's keep on going. And by the way, this is a little cartoon about that forgotten man. Again, many other political figures, especially presidential candidates, have talked about the forgotten man since FDR. And again, it's just kind of this idea here that you need to keep in mind, and you need to be doing these for the average American person, the average American worker, farmer, whatever else, that oftentimes gets left out of the political discussion. FDR's second term is going to be marked by a huge showdown between him and the Supreme Court. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to kind of explain why FDR and the Supreme Court were not getting along, and then I'll talk more about what FDR tries to do in order to exercise his influence over the Supreme Court. So in 1937, the Supreme Court is conservative and old. You see a picture of them here, not to be rude, but these are not exactly young spring chickens. They are also extremely conservative. So, six, by the way, of the nine members over 70, and really had not acted favorably towards a lot of the New Deal programs. In FDR's first term, 9 New Deal cases had gone to the Supreme Court. These were mostly cases that were challenging, for example, the constitutionality of a New Deal program or something along those type of lines. And in 7 of the 9 cases, the ruling of the Supreme Court was very much against FDR and the New Deal. So already issues and problems. In addition, you remember that if a Supreme Court justice retires or dies, that the president has the ability to appoint a new one. And there has to be approval, but nonetheless, during FDR's entire first term, nobody had died, nobody had resigned, nobody had retired, so he had not had any Supreme Court appointments. So this very much angered him. And it makes sense, by the way. FDR has largely been able to get what he's wanted. Remember, he also has a Congress that is Democrat, so they largely support him and kind of rubber stamp most of the New Deal legislation. And this is really the only group that kind of stands in FDR's way in regards to totally exercising all the goals and all the plans he had for the New Deal. The Supreme Court felt that they needed to be this more conservative element against the socialist measures that the New Deal was proposing. And FDR is going to argue basically here, hey, the Supreme Court, in shutting down some of these New Deal programs and acting against me and my administration, is really actually acting against the American people. Again, pointing to the election victories in 32, 34, and 36, showing the approval of the New Deal, at least early on. And so he's going to say, listen, this can't go on. So he really has this decision and idea here that he's got to get the Supreme Court to abide by what he wants. So the scheme that FDR comes up with in 1937 is known as the court packing plan, or packing the court. And basically what his goal here was to get his influence over the Supreme Court. Well, how are they going to do that? There's only 9 members of the Supreme Court. Even though they're old, they're still not retiring. They're still in good enough health to continue on. So FDR's plan and what he proposes is that for every justice that is over 70 years old, a new justice will also be appointed. So this is not in replacement, this is just an additional judge. And if this scheme had worked out, again, there were 6 judges of the 9 that were over 70, that would have meant there would be 15 total judges. And the 6, basically, you can kind of see here on the political cartoon, the idea was that these would be total yes men to FDR, and they would be able, as well as the members of the current members of the Supreme Court that were liberal, in order to push the rest of the New Deal legislation and all those type of things. This scheme is going to definitely bring anger from the Supreme Court as well as courts all over the country. It's also going to bring some anger from the American people who really feel that this is an overstep of boundaries and powers for FDR, and he's not really respecting the checks and balances. It's really interesting. The United States people typically have been relatively favorable to the Supreme Court as far as feeling as though their opinion and their decisions should be respected. So even though FDR is extremely popular and his popularity is still high in 1937, for the American people, this is just too much. And this is really that kind of final straw for them, or their limit, I should say, as to him being able to exercise his powers further. For the first time, really, in FDR's career as president, and even really his career as governor of New York, this is the big political failure. All right. And this is really the one time where his goal and his scheme just doesn't work at all. And he receives backlash from it. So that's really the first time that we see that for FDR. And it's something that occurs a couple other times throughout his presidency, but not very often. So it's a really interesting deal. We see this reflected in 1938, where the Republican Party will gain a lot more seats in Congress. It's still going to be a Democrat majority, but in 1938, the fact that a lot of seats will swing to the Republicans is kind of a sign to us that people did not approve of this. And there's also going to be some other things that go on. But this is really that kind of final straw for a lot of people as far as FDR being able to exercise his power. You see here again, yes, we all vote yes. This is the idea. If they put these 6 people on, that's exactly what they're going to do for FDR, whatever he so wants. Again, here's the backlash. FDR, all I said was give me 6 more justices. Again, for most people, this is just too much. And here we see this, the 6 new justices all depicted as FDR. So once again, showing that basically if this had gone to plan, and it won't at all, it's going to be totally kiboshed, this would have really been the Supreme Court just kind of rubber stamping what FDR wanted. So even though a huge political defeat, and even though this will not happen, there's kind of ironically going to be a few things that are going to occur that actually allow FDR to kind of achieve what he initially wanted, but not by the means he intended to do so. So one of the biggest things that's going to occur kind of right after this is one of the Supreme Court justices, Owen Roberts, is going to become more liberal. And as he does, the Supreme Court will become more sympathetic to the New Deal. Remember, there's 9 members of the Supreme Court. Before Roberts went liberal and more kind of in favor of the New Deal, most of what the Supreme Court decided was on a vote of 5-4 against the New Deal. But with his shift, now we're going to see a lot of decisions made 5-4, but in favor of the New Deal. And so that's a really, really big thing. What the Supreme Court will do following 1937 is not really New Deal legislation. It's going to be more so upholding old controversial legislation that had been passed in a couple years before. So, for example, one of the big ones is going to be Social Security. Big challenge, by the way, and they will uphold it. So that's going to be seen as significant, and definitely the court turning a kind of more favorable turn to this. And so that's really significant. What also is going to happen is that there's going to be something passed that's going to give full pay to any justice that retires that's over the age of 70 years old. Well, with that incentive, some old justices that were over 70 will retire. And then FDR is going to be able to appoint judges to replace them that are going to be more fond and more respectable of his opinions and his New Deal dealings. And so, again, I think that's really kind of interesting. He wanted to get rid of these people anyway, but his decision, or his initial thought was to pack the court. But now something else happens that kind of allows these people to leave largely on their own terms. So this kind of works out for him in the long run. To show this, by the way, after 1937 into the remainder of FDR's remaining terms in office, he's going to have a couple more, spoiler, he will appoint 9 Supreme Court justices. That is more than any other president, and the same as George Washington, who was the first to actually appoint very initially on at the birth of the nation. So again, huge influence here. And again, he's able to assemble the court largely with people that, he felt favorable to the Democratic Party, felt favorable to the New Deal and his kind of beliefs. So really kind of an interesting thing that we're looking at there as this kind of falls into play. However, because of what's going on globally at this point, as well as because of some of the political failures, not a lot of New Deal legislation is going to come out in FDR's second term. It's going to be a few things, but most of what happens here is just kind of, again, upholding the existing New Deal legislation and cementing it as being constitutional and within the rights of the president and the government. This, by the way, is a look at Owen Roberts and his shift to becoming a more liberal and more kind of sympathetic and friendly to the New Deal is going to mark a huge shift for, where the New Deal was originally. So what happens here? How does the New Deal kind of end? Well, a couple things to consider. For as much as these programs created jobs, remember that a lot of the jobs are temporary and they obviously don't employ everyone. And by 1936, unemployment was still at about 15%, down from the initial 25%, but 15% unemployment is still relatively high. You can see here on this graph, early 1937, it will dip to about 11-ish, which is great, but that does not last long. Recovery, by the way, up until 1936, not bad necessarily, but we definitely didn't see the complete revival of the American economy or American industries or factories and whatever else. And the big kind of hit is going to happen in 1937 when there's a little recession that's going to take place that's going to increase unemployment, that's going to worsen the economic standing of the United States even a little bit more. Why does recession occur in 1937? Well, one of the reasons why is because those Social Security taxes were finally coming into payrolls. And so that obviously is going to hurt a little bit, that initial shock of having to pay for that if you're a business. The other thing is that up to this point, FDR and most American presidents had tried to maintain a balanced budget. And because of this, there was some spending that had been cut in order to try to achieve this balanced budget, which also is not going to suit well for the economy in 1937. Because of kind of rethinking the economy and spending and things like that, the United States will largely convert to a new kind of idea of economics. This is from the British economist John Maynard Keynes, and his philosophy floats into Keynesian economics. There's a lot that can be said about Keynesian economics, but one of the big things that is going to start to happen in this regard and in this context is that this says it's okay for the government to deficit spend, so spend more than they actually bring in, because that's what's going to stimulate the economy, especially in a time of recession. And so again, this is a really kind of interesting new philosophy, because up to this point, a lot of American presidents had really tried to make sure the budget was balanced, not create a lot of debt, but Keynes and followers of Keynesian economics are going to say, no. If you want to stimulate the economy, the government's got to spend, even if they're spending more than they bring in, because that's what's going to stimulate this. That's what's going to make this work. And so that's what is going to happen and go on there. And by the way, today, the U.S. government does largely the same thing, as our debt and deficit is extremely high. That's kind of a whole other story, and I would like to get into that at some point, but we really can't. But, again, that's what the government does today. One of the last pieces, it's somewhat New Deal as far as reform is concerned, is the Hatch Act. It's not necessarily totally economic related. It's more so political um, transparency, I would suggest, more than anything else. And this sets up campaign finance reform for candidates. It also forbids certain actions by federal employees. What you're trying to do is kind of officially eliminate any remainder of the spoils system and things like that. So those type of things being important. Also, again, that you don't have like an unfavorable favors coming in from people that pay to campaigns and things like that. This has been largely extended today, but it's not great, but it's a good cursory step. The reality is, though, because of some of these issues, but really because of the things that are going to be going on in Europe and Asia, the New Deal is going to kind of come to a close. Not many New Deal programs really into the later part of the 1930s, and instead the United States will shift its focus to dealing with the crisis overseas and the rest of the world. Here, by the way, you see that unemployment rate that we were talking about earlier, and again, we see obviously a decline in 1933 following the implementation of early New Deal programs, but again, we see it shoot back up in 1938, and then we really won't see super low unemployment, until 1942, and that is going to have to do more so with World War II and the huge economic transformation that will actually take place. In reality, even though the New Deal definitely does some things to improve the U.S.'s economic situation, it really does not cure the Great Depression, and it will really take the U.S.'s role in World War II in order for that to actually fully occur. Okay, some ideas about Keynesian economics. I mentioned some of these. These have a few more, but I'll point you to the fourth point here. In a world of stagnation or depression, direct state intervention may be essential to restore confidence and lift demand. So that's what is kind of the big component here that's going to be taken into place by FDR in the later 1930s, and is going to be a big pillar of U.S. economic policy even today. And we can see that, by the way, in the changing of federal debt throughout United States history. You can see here that really, for the most part, relatively low. And then by the time we get into the later 1930s, increasing into World War II, huge increase. And then even today, we're seeing big numbers. And then that's just projected to continue to go on and on. These, by the way, are some things that federal employees may not do under the Hatch Act, and some of these things have been expanded since, like the last point about computers and printers and copiers, fax machines, and telephones. But this is basically the idea that if you're a federal employee, you really should not be involved in election type of stuff, because that is an overstep of your boundaries. That's a conflict of interest, all that kind of stuff. Want to conclude by talking about two things. And one is the reasons why some are going to deem the New Deal a failure, and the reasons why some are going to deem the New Deal a success. And then I'll shift you over to the primary sources and this information so you can get a little bit more acquainted with it. First off, no matter what side you sit on, the New Deal is controversial. All right. For a few reasons, but one of the biggest things you can think about is the fact that it totally changes the role of government in the United States. And never really before does the government take such an active approach in the economy, in people's lives, and other things like that. So some of the reasons why some people are going to say the New Deal was a failure was because it was wasteful. Spent too much money, basically, and not enough really return on that investment. So I'm going to say the New Deal programs were contradictory. We kind of saw that with some of the programs yesterday. Like for example, the AAA telling farmers to not grow on all their farmland in a time of hunger. Okay, that's definitely contradictory. Some would say if you really look at more and more of these programs, there's so much contradictoriness in them. So they would say that's another reason why it should be deemed a failure. Some are going to say it was way too communist. Some arguing that FDR was trying to turn the United States into a new kind of Soviet Union. Another thing kind of related to that is that because of how much the government was providing, the United States was turning into a handout state. And for a lot of people, that was not ever what the United States was supposed to be about. The United States was supposed to be about individualism, hard work, the government being a quiet force in people's lives, not overbearing. I'm going to say because of the New Deal, you completely change that. So that is no good. Other opponents of the New Deal are going to say way too big of an increase in government spending, and also going to argue that it hurt business because of the largely positive things that happened for workers and small farmers and things like that. So that was a hurt of business. Also, something like Social Security, which required businesses to also contribute to as well. I said these things are hurtful for business and their ability to be successful. You're going to also have some that say this, and this is kind of the truth no matter how you look at it. At the end of the day, the New Deal does not solve the Great Depression. What it does do is it does provide some mild relief, fixing some of the immediate issues and problems, but there's still going to be unemployment. There's still going to be production, consumption issues. And then another thing, and you'll kind of see this in some of the sources, is that the New Deal programs do not cover everyone. And in particular, the big groups that are not covered are predominantly women, blacks, and Mexican Americans. So those are minority groups, and because of the structure of a lot of the programs, they are either not benefited or they are hurt, by the way, by some of these programs. But I'll give you a look at the sources for you to see that a little more explicitly. By the way, some critics of the New Deal are also going to mock it by calling the agencies FDR's alphabet soup because, of all the various acronyms. And so I posted this cartoon here to show that. Again, another look at the unemployment. Again, we do see a decline initially, but the reality is even, by 1939, unemployment still over 15%, and it's going to take the war demands of World War II to really actually decrease unemployment to very low levels in the United States. Okay, there's definitely a lot of reasons why people might argue the New Deal was a success. And first off, just like the other one said, the New Deal is still controversial, still definitely changes the role of government. But fans of the New Deal, New Dealers, are going to say, you know what, at least it did something. All right, did something in order to try to change the economy and pick things up. And the biggest thing they're going to point to is they're going to say, hey, look, it provided relief. All right, it really, really did. All right, yeah, maybe it didn't quite do, all the big things as far as totally recovering the economy and all that. But they're going to say, hey, it was a way better situation than what it was in 1932, early 1933. All right, because then it was horrible. All right, and there were people starving and there were people homeless. Well, this did technically solve the hunger problem by most intensive purposes. It also helped the homeless problem. All right, you don't really have the Hoovervilles necessarily anymore once the New Deal starts going. Once you have more programs that give some money to people, you also have some programs that allow the ability of people to be able to figure out their mortgages, figure out payments, and all the rest of that kind of stuff. So that's going to be another big part of this as well. Some advocates of the New Deal are going to say, hey, look, it actually is going to help business. All right. Even though, workers' wages and other things are going to increase, the reality is this is going to set business up on a much better relationship with their workers, which is going to help pave the way to success, especially during World War II. Again, we do see reform in a time of suffering during the New Deal, and think about some of those programs that are still around today. The FDIC, the SEC, Social Security, even something like the FHA, these things are still around because they still serve an essential purpose in protecting and caring for people in the U.S. economy. Others are also going to say, hey, look, yeah, it was definitely more left than what we've seen before in American history, but it wasn't that less left. And they're going to say it's not socialism. So if you want to look at socialism, look at crazy Huey Long. Look at those type of people that criticized FDR for not doing enough. So they're going to kind of point more to that and say, hey, look, FDR could have made this a totally socialist state. Could have been a complete, equality, communism, and stuff, but that never happens, right? And again, there's a lot of restraint to what FDR does. All right, so in conclusion, we've talked obviously last 3 class periods now about the New Deal. If you go to Google Classroom, there's some primary sources. It's a primary source set, a variety of mostly primary sources on the New Deal, and then 1 or 2 secondary sources. And they all surround this question of whether or not the New Deal was a success. And so we kind of phrase it this way: to what extent was the New Deal a success? So what I'd like you to do, based on the documents and the background information, is to create kind of just a very mini essay DBQ. So it's just mini because I don't really necessarily need a formal intro, formal conclusion, anything like that. But what I do want is you to read through the documents. I want you to look back at your notes and really think about this. And I want you to come up with one paragraph that talks about the reasons why the New Deal was a success. Again, being specific based on what the documents say and based on what we talked about in class. Another paragraph, the reasons why the New Deal was a failure. Once again, using the documents, using the information we talked about in class. And then finally, your last paragraph, justification. Was the New Deal more of a success than a failure? More of a failure than a success? And why do you think so? All right, again, realizing that there are reasons it can be considered a success, reasons it can be considered a failure, but at the end of the day, if you had to pick a position, which way would you sit? All right. So anyways, I'll look forward to reading those and seeing what you have to write. Again, this is good incorporation of the documents and all that kind of stuff. And thanks as always. Start up World War II next week. I'm still in the chat for the rest of the class. If you have anything, email. Obviously, I'm always around. And I look forward to wrapping this up, reading your responses, as well as getting into World War II next week. Thanks as always. Have a nice weekend and stay healthy and safe.